So in addition to the four presenters, we have Michelle Kahane and Yang Guobin.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very honored to be on this panel. I think it's a very exciting day of events, and I've really enjoyed the presentations of our panel. I think what I'm going to do is to ask a question or two of each of the speakers, and then a few general points, general comments or questions and responses. So starting with Sanjay, discussion about the micro geopolitics of resistance. So you ended with the sort of question about the migratory bird. And I think I really love that image. I thought that migratory bird is flying around the globe, that it is true that it's not just happening in India, but also in China. In other words, the micro geopolitics of resistance that you describe of the Chipko kind, we find many examples of the kind in China today as well. So I would like to mainly to just mention a couple of examples of the Chinese case, since you asked this question, and just to really to emphasize the importance of this point. So in the Chinese case, Judy early on talked about the leisure walks in several of the recent environmental protest activities. I think that's one of the interesting example of micropolitics in China today. Because of the political nature of protesting in China, at some point, I think it was in 2007 in Xiamen, this happened first, that organizers began to call on people to go to the city square to take a leisure walk. Of course, what they actually meant was to have a demonstration, have a rally, but they didn't use the language of protest, but instead used leisure walk. I think that's a very good example of micropolitics. But micropolitics is in all sorts of places. I think there are also, in the discussions, we also mentioned about microblogging, micropower. Now there's all this talk about the potential of resistance through blogs, microblogs, Weibo, and so on. It seems to be all about micropolitics, and I think that's important in China as well. And I think it's in some ways it's also important in the U.S. Right here in New York City, the Occupy movement has a lot of micropolitics. So that's my quick response to Sanjay's point. I was trying to find my question, what kind of question I have for you. I can't find it now, so I'll wait. Whether I'll have a question for you, I'm not sure yet. But that's a quick response to your presentation. To Professor Dong's presentation, I also really enjoy your presentation. I think yours also share with Sanjay's in terms of your interest in local responses to local problems. And you talk about various forms of local responses. I'm particularly struck with the various kind of organizational forms that you mentioned in those local areas, like farmers association, and several, it's all about local organization. I'm struck by that because of the other point about micropolitics, that we know that in contemporary China, organizing is a difficult thing, that there are difficulties. So I'm very impressed, very struck by the kind of local organizing that is happening in those communities. And I think it seems that they have some, they take some peculiar forms, that they are different, for instance, from the kind of protest organizing in the city. So I would love to hear more about how what kind of organizations, right? Why do they work, right? So it's about the innovation in organizational form in response to local problems. To Victoria's presentation, my question is also about local responses. It's somewhat different. I think your project is somewhat different from others, but I still want to ask the question about local response, since your project is really about urban intervention. So it sounds like it's the intervention from the outsider's point of view, that it's about scientists and so on, design and so on. So I wonder, what kind of local responses do you have, or did you try to incorporate local responses, local input into the design of these kind of projects? I'd love to hear more about that aspect. So that's for Victoria. And last is for Nidhi. I really love your presentation, and really I share a great deal your critique of the very concept of innovation. And actually, I prepared a few points which I wanted to, I'm trying to find on my laptop. I think essentially, I wanted to make a similar kind of critique about the concept of innovation that after a day or two of discussion, how shall we put this concept, the very concept itself, in question, interrogating this concept, because it seems to be everywhere, but it's particularly popular in business school courses, right? I share that your critique, but I'm again couldn't find my file actually, and I think I'm not going to try to. In terms of my question for you, the politics, the sort of open-ended politics that you talked about, and final 2 points. What the politics about? It's about contestation. It's about contradiction. Again, I agree very much with you about the importance of emphasizing social innovation and the political aspects of this. I'd love to hear you talk more about the various parties involved in this contestation, in this social conflict. So because we generally hear, when we talk about processes of social innovation, interaction, we really hear it's a process, it's quite a smooth process, without conflict, without contestation. Things seems to be great. That's why we talk about innovation, social innovations. But you basically emphasize a very different aspect. So what happens then when NGOs from the outside try to innovate, try to introduce new methods, new forms of doing things into a local community? What kind of contestation actually happen, and or do they happen? And when they do happen, how do people deal with this kind of situation? It sounds that the kind of case studies that you work with may have some answers to these questions. So these are a few questions for the speakers. So as I said, I couldn't find my notes. I do think I have a couple of points which I'll just mention. One is the central point about how we can sort of think critically about the concept of social innovation. I think really you've laid out the groundwork for doing such a critique. I also want to bring up a point which I think emphasized very much by David Ludden in the earlier panel about the importance of social inequality in the discussion of environmental issues. and to sort of to raise the question about the contextual nature of social innovation. And I would like to give you just an example to show what I mean by the contextual nature of social innovation. Some of us here may know that in 2005, 2004, early 2000, there were a series of very violent environmental protest activities in Zhejiang province that local villages really innovated in trying to protest the polluting factories which were polluting their land and so on. And one innovation they had was they didn't make claims about environmental protection because it was very hard to prove. This is, to prove causation that the children who are sick because of the polluted air are really because of the pollution, right? It's very hard to. So what they did was to make claims about their land, that they wanted to reclaim the land because the land was rented out to the factories, and now they wanted to kick the factories out. So now they want. It happens that there are government regulations at this time about all this industrial park you need to clean up, and especially clean up polluting factories. So they made these kind of claims, and of course also used other strategies of protest, and they won. The interesting thing is that they won because they really worked together. They organized the whole village. Several villages were able to work together. But at the same time, the villages in this area were also polluted by their own cottage industry. Mm-hmm. There was a whole cottage industry of recycling in this area. Nobody seemed to try to organize, to protest these local polluting industries. So, why were they protesting against some factories but not against others, right? I think this is, I would argue that this reflects the contextual nature of some of the social innovation. They were not willing to, they didn't seem to be reluctant to be willing, to be happy to innovate in terms of trying to deal with the pollution caused by their own community members, partly because it was part of them, that they themselves, their own relatives, their own friends, their own villages were polluting. So it's the kind of local, in other words, local communities, in many cases, may be the foundation of very effective social innovation organizing. In other cases, may also become the obstacles to innovation. So I wanted to bring up this case just to sort of complicate the issue about social innovation. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Michelle, would you like to offer something?
So I'd like to very much thank the India-China Institute for inviting me to be a discussant, and all of the speakers yesterday and today, because I have learned a great deal from all of you, and frankly, I believe it will be quite influential in my work as I go forward. So thank you, all of you. I also want to say that I was a very reluctant discussant. I was quite concerned because I don't have background in ecology or environment. And I was asked to come here because the Institute felt that because of my experience as in philanthropy, particularly working for the Ford Foundation and the Clinton Foundation for a good number of years, I would have a particular vantage point. And I pondered that for a while to think, okay, so how would that vantage point be useful here? So, and I should say that I'm a professor of professional practice at Milano, at the School of International Affairs, Management, and Urban Policy here. Not a scholar by training, but rather a practitioner who comes here with 2 decades of experience. and is now really trying to understand social innovation in a more, in this context of academia, rather than in the practice world. But to my point about working in a foundation, we saw ourselves at the Ford Foundation as field builders, which is rather presumptuous, I think. From up above in the well-resourced and endowed organizations like Ford, Rockefeller, Gates, et cetera, we were building fields. And what we meant by that was that we were investing in innovative ideas, innovative organizations, innovative people. And how did we do that? Well, it wasn't just money. We also convened people around these ideas. We influenced agendas and resource flows more broadly. And as such, I want to bring a field building perspective here today, but I also want to acknowledge that since coming here several years ago now, I have become deeply critical of this approach. And I think that the presentations today, deeply critical of this approach from the perspective of a sort of top-down approach towards innovation. And so my core questions really are about how do we create capacity really and the resources to support that capacity to innovate at local levels. And but I see the trends completely going in the reverse, actually. So what we're seeing is, in Matthew Bishop's well-known book on philanthropic capitalism, that frankly, there are more and more private resources being combined, whether being corporations or large foundations or financial institutions, that are now extraordinarily influential, meeting every year at the Clinton Global Initiative, which is also a place I used to work, and really influencing agendas. Now, inviting NGOs, certainly, who often come there with great enthusiasm. Some of them are very effective at engaging with folks from Gates and others, but most come away feeling disempowered. And so when I think about social innovation, I think about it in a number of ways. And we talk there, and frankly, as I was looking at the papers and listening yesterday, it's just, there's an extraordinary array of types of social innovation in terms of outcomes. But I think what isn't looked at well enough is the question of how can the capacity, the enduring capacity for social innovation be created at the community level. So when we look at types of innovation as outcome, and I think that it may be similar to your point about tools, you know, there are, let me step back for a moment, because I think it's really interesting to also say that social innovation is not new. It's not a new phenomenon, right? And you talked a bit about the historical, from a historical perspective. If you look at the Ashoka website, and I only point to the organization Ashoka, which is a global organization, been around for 30 years, and it's very much focused on social entrepreneurship and social innovation. But when they have a web page where they say, here are examples of social innovators in history, and the list goes on to include people like Susan Anthony, who fought for women's rights, Viola Bhav, who was the leader of the land gifts movement, Florence Nightingale in India, Florence Nightingale, founder of the modern nursing, and John Muir, who established the national park system. So clearly, these are examples, I think, of in diverse fields of leaders who have built movements. But what's interesting is that even though these are examples of, you know, social innovators that Ashoka sort of touts, and Ashoka as an organization is one of the sort of leading sort of institutions defining that field, it seems that now, more and more, it's being usurped by the business schools, you know, as a phenomenon and as a field of practice, which I share your concern about. You know, in the presentations today and yesterday, as I stated, I think that there was a wide array of types of social innovations, including new norms and standards. I was really struck by the example yesterday by Professor Liu talking about the Tibetan monk who helped to create a new category of sacred bird through both science, organizing, and leadership, which are critical enablers. In our country here, there are movements of all sorts, obviously, as well, including those to stop tobacco smoking, to end obesity, to drunk driving, and promote same-sex marriage. Again, all of these new normative movements require the capacity to organize and to lead. Another category of social innovation are new practices, whether in farming, forestry, herding, conservation, hospice care. So again, many of these practices must be informed, again, by engaging science and other disciplines. Social innovation is also takes the form of policy, whether it be Social Security or land tenure reform. New products and services. We learned from Nidhi's presentation about pump sharing, energy-efficient stoves, are another set of examples. New institutions are critical in this country or around the world. Libraries were a social innovation. So are community colleges, and so are microfinance institutions. New associational forms were also illustrated in some of the presentations, whether they're Nidhi's forest councils or the herding association and grazing associations that we heard about in the examples as well before. And new technology is a critical outcome, and as well as facilitator of social innovation. And in Victoria's presentation, we heard how important new tools for data visualization, et cetera, can help inform new urban design. And finally, and this is not the full list of possible social innovations, social innovation as outcome, but new governance forms. So these can be both local, new forms of governance, both local as well as global, and we're seeing many more sort of voluntary governance forms, including around natural resource management, like the Marine Stewardship Council and the Forest Stewardship Council. So there's an extraordinary array and examples of social innovations that are both have both been described here in the presentations, and many, many others, which is a bit overwhelming when you're trying to teach or study social innovation. So for me, I think, as I think about this field of, or practice of social innovation, the core question is, if social innovation is important for society, and I do think of it as kind of the ability of society to problem solve, how do we create those capacities so that people at the level of communities can be central to social innovation? And so I think this is this brings a set of specific questions that I would present to the panel, including, and some of them already have been posed in the last 2 days, but what kind of knowledge do we need to innovate? Who holds this knowledge, and what kinds of new institutions need to be created to access and make usable such knowledge? Secondly, how do we reconceive the notion of the professional in social innovation? And Nidhi's spent a lot of time thinking about this as well. So, you know, I think of the example yesterday, and I'm drawing from both panels, but of Professor Liu's community scientist, again, the Tibetan monk as community scientist, or Bunker Roy's Barefoot College and the sort of creation of a whole new kind of professional, which he refers to as the barefoot professional. The third question is, what type of local associations and institutions are needed to support and facilitate collective experimentation? and co-management of resources. And again, we've seen a lot of examples of this, but my essential question is how do we begin to see these as the fundamentals of social innovation, and not sort of the interesting examples of them. And finally, I would say, because I'm probably taking too long, time is up, the last question is I think essential, which is really about money. And so how to bring, so that the negotiated space that Nidhi was describing before, well, there'll always be that contested space, but the power of money is extraordinary. So how do we create seriously real community foundations, not the kind that we see here in the United States, which are essentially the money of the rich, that are kind of being managed financially, right? But really money that is managed by communities for what they believe to be their needs. That's it. So this is a set of general questions rather than targeted questions.
No, thank you so much, Michelle. And it points to several of the areas that I wanted to bring to the discussion as well. So I'm going to be very, very brief, and then we'll get responses from everybody. So I will reiterate the framing question that is coming from the vision of the new school, and what is the role of design in this discussion, especially when social innovation is questioned, critiqued, theorized in the way we've heard at the end of this panel. And you take the word social out, and so innovation, I mean, we've been told in the U.S. that we've been an innovative economy since, World War II or whatever, and so there's a kind of something built into the megalopolis that was one of Victoria's models, which is, on the West Coast now, and so we have a culture of innovation, and where's the social located in that? And the designer knows where to locate his or herself within that first model, but the second model is one of the critical questions we have. And the other question, so there's a kind of disciplinary question, and theory, practice, design. And then the other one is, and I really want to go back to the scaling question, because it's remarkable, but that because the environmental sustainability issue was driving the question of social innovation, we went to the grasslands, the forests, the places of scarcity, the oceans. And so the types of social innovation we found were traditional, let's say, very pragmatic and practical, immediate resourcefulness. And so I put that kind of at odds with this other model of innovation coming from Silicon Valley and MIT and all that sort of stuff that's coming from North America. And so that's a kind of big scale question. And then then I have the question about the difference, and this is driving India-China Institute. This is my role here to bring it back to what is the difference between India and China as we scale up these micro and scale down these technocratic things coming from advanced knowledge places. How does India and China, how do they do it differently? And I think they do radically differently in all the examples we've heard. This state is in the middle of this because there's something else called the extra state. And so the extra state organizations are the only ones capable of addressing the forests, the Tibetan Plateau, the watersheds, the megacities that are below them. We have the greater Mekong subregion, for example, which is something I'm really looking at very closely because I work in Southeast Asia. And so these extra state organizations become really critical, and it's especially exciting to see the Asian constellations, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations in 2015 as an economic community that are really creating a kind of new territory. So, I mean, Ashok and Yang, they know me always, I'm sort of trying to break down the national boundaries as a kind of mindset in India-China discourse. And so that's my 2 cents, or 3. And so I'd like to go from my left to right again. Maybe I should reverse the order just to be fair and start with me and end with Sanjay, please.
These are extraordinarily rich comments from all the 3 people, from Guobin, Yang, Michelle, as well as from Brian. I'm not going to be foolish enough to try to respond to every one of the comments raised. It would be unfair to my colleagues. It wouldn't give them enough time. So what I'm going to do is to just signal a couple of aspects. If you wish, these are the areas where I want to sort of make it amply clear where I stand. There are other areas where I will indicate where I stand when needed, or my colleagues will indicate for me. First, I think a lot of the comments are about a question of naming. Are we naming something as social innovation? Are we naming it as civil society? Are we naming it as democratic movements? For instance, when Sanjay Chaturvedi spoke about the Chipko movement, I was quite intrigued, since I've always thought of it as a social movement. But at one point, he did signal quite deliberately that this was a social innovation, and that's quite intriguing to think of a social movement as an innovation, but why not, right? So to me, when we're looking at it as questions of naming, I wouldn't be comfortable saying there's one name that is accurate and one name that is not. I think that maybe is, I'm signaling very clearly where I stand. I'd be more comfortable with the historiography of naming. Why has a name emerged? What does that name do? What does a name conjure up? What is it that makes our hearts beat faster when we hear the phrase civil society, or on the other hand, hear the phrase social innovation? And shouldn't we be a little careful when our hearts beat faster for those reasons? Because the reason our hearts beat faster might be due to perhaps romanticized uses of those terms, right? So given that, then to respond directly to what Brian said about design, I would say that the challenge here then is to actually move away from the disciplinary orientations we all have and to be committed to the people we study. I would like to be committed to the people I studied in India and in China, because I observed them in considerable distress. And I was humbled by it, and I remain shamed by it, because I don't experience considerable distress of any kind. And I have that privilege that, to that extent, they don't. And so to me, therefore, it's not really very important whether we call it design or management. It's much more important to say what is it from their perspective. That leads me to a comment I wanted to make about Guobin Yang's very generous and kind comments about my presentation. I was looking at these people, and my concern was to understand how they went about their day-to-day work. And so I observed the innovations as they emerged. And what I recall vividly is a high level of sensitivity to social differences. One aspect of that I'm going to say very briefly when I turn to Michelle's comment, but the other aspect I just wish to state is incredible investment in negotiation. In everything that was happening around me, work went in already to negotiate something before I emerged and while I was there. So the image of the forest warden that I showed you was not because he was making a routine visit. The routine visit would have been, he would have shown me that part of the Gwali Gongshan, and then we'd have gone on. The villagers expected him. They knew he would come. They waylaid him. But they did not waylay him by saying, we have a demand. They waylaid him by saying, how are you? Who is this stranger who's coming here to see us? Once the stranger is introduced, they say, aha, I see. You want to know about intermediate technology, whatever you want to call it. We have beehives. The beehives are shown. This leads an entry point for them to then turn to the official and say, by the way, you had mentioned you'd be giving us some beehives. What happened to that? In short, what I noticed was a profoundly complex way in which claims are framed within what is a local vocabulary that is acceptable. In short, exactly what Guobin Yang mentioned about people going out for a walk when they're actually going out on a protest. Similarly, I don't have the time to say this now, but when I studied some of the hutongs in Beijing that were able to resist the demolition that had happened across Beijing of the hutongs through the 90s, again, I learned that there was a very indirect way in which these negotiations took place. And I feel some of that was signaled also with the images in India. I don't have any more time on that, so I'll just end with this very quick comment on what Michelle said. Very rich comments. I really thank you, Michelle. I want to very briefly state, in terms of knowledge and professionalization, I was greatly moved by a conversation I had with a gentleman whose name I won't mention. When I was in India studying this NGO, we spoke in Hindi, and his question to me in Hindi was, "Do you understand Hindi?" To which I said, "Yes, but not well." He said, "Tell me, why is it when I speak in English, I get paid much more than when I speak in Hindi?" I said, "That's a very good question." I said that in Hindi, by the way. And then he said, "You know, there are people in my organization do exactly what I do. They speak in English and they're called managers. I am not called a manager." I was very struck by this, and then as we spoke in Hindi, I understood very greatly what he does for a living, and most of what he does for a living is he goes, understands the customs and the folkways of the people the NGO is trying to serve, and translates them into a manner which the NGO can use to intervene. In short, he is a conduit for negotiation. And so it seems to me extraordinarily important that when we are naming, we also recognize that the languages we use to name exclude some, while they also involve others.
I just want to answer the question about local inputs for the project. No, I didn't. I was very interested to actually develop a system where all different types of inputs could find their way through and also change over time. So I chose not to pick the multitudes of issues that I find in any urban environment and privilege any of them, but rather try to find the right scales and spaces in which and system urban strategies where change could fit and make sense spatially. So it's very sort of terrifying to do a project like that in a room with so many social scientists and say, I didn't talk to anyone. But I did it for a reason, and which was to try to find a way that could happen, right? So I hope it's clear that actually that's what's right up front. But when you try to be sort of take on the scales that most people tell you you're not allowed to, it's too big. You know, you have to, they're different, you get sort of, you do other things towards the same goal. I suppose that's what I'm saying. So I hope it's clear that by offering a drawing set, not a single image, by having layers that are actually have inconsistencies between them, to have them, some of them move backwards and forwards in time, was also a design strategy to open up space for urban design as a beyond the master plan and as an empowering tool at the bigger scale.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Yang, Professor Kan Han, and Professor Margaret. Actually, you give us these invaluable suggestions and comments. So, first, I would like to answer the question: what is innovation? From my standing, so for me, just like innovation, it's kind of social innovation. It's kind of let's say local knowledge-based adaptive management. In terms of local resources, natural resources. So I really agree with Professor Yang's point that local institution is the foundation of social innovation, but I would also add some words, kind of local knowledge-based management is a tool, approach of social innovation. So this is my understanding of social innovation from my perspective, especially on grassland management studies. So, in terms of institution, I did a very, I would like to say that a comparative study among 3 case sites. I would like to say in China, actually, local institution was, let's say, eroded in the past due to the policy. Kind of when we look at the grassland management policy since 1960s, it's the first communal kind of communal grassland management, which is based on kind of let's say kind of communal leader, quite big decision maker, and after open up, the grassland were de-individualized. So traditional kind of clan were totally broken or eroded. So I would like to say nowadays, in China side, it's, there's no very formal local institution at all. But when we look at the case in Nepal, there's a really good local institution, which, very well structured and which also play very important role. Look, they have very, under the community committees that have different associations, like the livestock association, vegetable crop. They worked very, let's say, very cooperatively by looking at the community committee. So I think this is a quite very good thing China should learn from Nepal side. But I also in India side, I don't find a very strong local institution, which is, as strong as a Nepali case. So normally in India side, that most of herders are scattered. Come from different communities. So which is very difficult to make them to a formal institution. So that's briefly my understanding in terms of local institution. Yes, of course, local institution is the foundation of social innovation. I do agree. So in terms of Michelle's question, how do we create resources to support local kind of capacity? From my point of view, I think there are 2 kind of resources we should look at. One is from a financial point of view, another one from institution point of view. So both the internal institution and external institution should be created, like in China, the local herders community or some kind of local institution should be created. And also policy-based institutions should be created to support this local institution. So financial perspective, maybe local people that can collectively have some kind of foundation to support their grazing activities. Like in Nepal, they have kind of collective foundation there. So families join together and leave some money for the risk management. This kind of foundation at local level Nepal have, but do not have external financial resources from either government or NGO there. So, but in China, government give a lot of financial support, but this money I don't think is used properly. Like in the past, due to the grazing ban policy, China government, used a lot of money to build the shed for for the yaks or whatever livestock, but this money can not go to the ground. So that's kind of question. And also in India side, I didn't find any kind of institutional financial to support. That's my answer to Michelle. In terms of Brian's question, how to scale up macro level kind of management into national level. So I think we need to, let's say, work very cooperatively from different levels. Macro, headers level, policymaker, science together to make good policy. Like in China now, we are changing kind of dynamics. In some area, like in Sichuan and in the Mongolia part, that can have kind of at the experimental level, they have kind of community-based grassland management that we learn from inside China, but outside China we can learn cases from Nepal. So as a scientist, we also go to Ministry of Agriculture in China, the grassland biolocated by Ministry of Agriculture in China. So we give them very good cases like here, how Nepal doing and what lessons learned from Inner Mongolia case study and also Sichuan. So by doing so, I think in the future maybe this can be scaled. So thank you.
So the researcher is an intermediary.
Yeah, right.
Well, thank you, Chair. I'm also very grateful for these insightful comments that have come. Let me, with your permission, sort of put them in 2 or 3 categories and then respond. I think there's a difference between mainstream innovation and struggles for innovation that take place on the margins. And I think what makes Chipko so fascinating, and even today, and I think in the times to come also, this moment will demand and deserve a lot of rethinking and revisiting, is because Chipko, from one perspective, was also against meta-narratives of all kinds. And for example, Mr. Bahuguna acknowledged early on that there were 2 visions, but 1 movement. There was a vision of his friend, colleague, Bhatt, Mr. Bhatt, who was having a local wood industry, because you would remember 73, it was Simon's Bat Company that was trying to get the trees for their purpose. And Mr. Bahuguna, to begin with, had a different take on that. But the very fact that there was this dialogic politics, which is, to borrow Amartya Sen's concept of argumentative Indian, I think Chipko's strength was that it was both a combination of design, well thought of design, which developed over a period of time, and also it was also very spontaneous. For example, when Mr. Sailani sang that song on the rooftop of the bus in 1973, he had not designed, he had not thought about that poem. But the poetics of resistance became a very important tool in the hands of the leadership. So that's point 1. How do you create enduring capacity for innovation? I think it's a very important question. But in case of Chipko, I think the leaders were well aware of the fact that if they had the advantage of tradition, like Paul Routledge's work on Chipko reminds us that all these struggles have to be located in a particular context. So there was, in this part of India, a long tradition of resistance, struggles. But I think consciousness is also a very important factor, that consciousness, without consciousness, you cannot build a sustainable capacity to understand things, to fight against the emerging geographies of domination. It was also a struggle over definitions of knowledge. And this is what made Chipko and also APICO and more recent incarnations of that movement, so important is that, this entire questioning of a particular map of meaning being imposed on others. So it was also a resistance against the imposition of external maps of meaning. So what kind of knowledge do we need? I think Chipko's message was that it is for the communities who are affected as a result of certain policy to decide as to what kind of knowledge do they need. It is not left for eco-feminists, because we know that eco-feminist movement also looked at Chipko. There was also a sort of meta-narrative of deep ecology, as Professor Jayanto Bandyopadhyay has argued, and we know that Chipko was a far more complex movement than simply, a resonance in terms of deep ecology. Another point which I want to make is that it's very useful to see that, similar kind of movements in terms of micro-geopolitics are happening in China. Because I'm reminded of the argument that was made by a leading Indian political scientist, D.L. Sheth, who wrote an article in Economic and Political Weekly talking about micro-movements against globalization. And he said that these micro-movements are for participatory democracy. So I think what is happening, if we look at this imagery of migratory bird, is that there are similar micro-movements going on in different parts of the world. But the critical question, I think, comes from the French geographer Jan Gottman, who said that it's very important to understand as to how you move from the state of idea to the state of movement. And in case of Chipko, in case of various other struggles for innovation, you see trajectories, and you need details to understand those trajectories as to how, these visions and these ideas, they were taken, they were moved forward, and they reached where they eventually did. I think you have raised such an important question of differences between India and China, and also commonalities. And I think this is where, again, it's useful to remind ourselves of the fact that there are obvious differences in terms of political culture and political systems, but not necessarily in terms of philosophical traditions in China and India, because I think these movements cannot come from narrowly defined nation states. They can only come from societies which have a civilizational resilience. They have it in their historical memories, they have it in their consciousness. Sometimes that consciousness is not there, so that it's for the leaders to move in. It is for Mr. Sailani to have his harmonium and then sing those folk songs and invoke the sacred geographies, which also played a very, very important role. So I think this is where, again, one has to compare China and India, not only in terms of the differences in political culture, but also similarities in philosophical traditions, what is Confucianism has to offer, or what has other, Sufism, for example, has to offer in case of this part of the world. Role of extra-state institutions, I think that is extremely critical in my view, because you would recall my making a reference to a rather pessimistic statement made by Mr. Hegde, the leader of the APICO movement. And his point is that when you see these new partnerships between the state and the market, when you are in the context of hegemony of transnational liberalism, who is your target? What are you resisting against? Who are you resisting against? What kind of institutions are you resisting against? So I think this is where the challenge before the struggles become very important. Finally, your point of scale, because I think micro-geopolitics is driven by an interface which I call normative pragmatic interface. It draws on certain values, it draws on certain philosophical notions, but at the same time, it is not naive in terms of power and politics. We saw it in case of Chipko. We saw how Mr. Bahuguna negotiated with Mrs. Gandhi, how he could make certain selective political appeals, how he entered. And it was not an outright confrontation of government. It was also about changing the mind of the government. So it was not entirely driven by geopolitics of fear. It was also driven by politics of hope, with the result that we had new innovative policies from the government. For example, joint forest management schemes came in response to that. Finally, I'm reminded of Kevin Cox's notion of jumping the scales.
Okay.
And his point is that micro movements do not want to wither away as micro movements. They also have their ambitions. They want visibility. They want to have partnerships. They want to build solidarities. So movements do jump. They want to scale up. But scaling up, and I think that is another lesson to be learned from the Chipko, scaling up is a double-edged weapon. Because when you become more visible, your movement can also be hijacked. It can also happen that Mr. Sailani, Mr. Dhoop Singh Negi, and other hundreds and thousands of those who contributed through their imagination, through their hard work to the movement, get eclipsed, and then you have these new meta-narratives now. And I think one of the strong contenders of these meta-narratives is the climate change meta-narrative, which is now trying to sort of have a new framing of the forest, lungs of the planet Earth, carbon sinks. And there is a danger that we may have another attempt to empty out these places called forests, because in this part of the world, we're not talking about wilderness at all. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have exceeded our time, and I think I've exhausted the panel, but I do want to give the audience an opportunity to make any final questions or statements, not necessarily have to be answered. So I'm going to take whoever feels they really want to contribute something. So 1, 2, 3.
I'd like to congratulate the conference for being so coherent. But I think the coherence has been implied rather than explicit, and I would like to make it more explicit. The question, I think, is what kind of difference does India and China make? And I think the difference is that both of these countries, both of these civilizations have endured centuries of colonialism and imperialism. And this refers to the question that Libor asked, which is why is it 2,000 years ago we had this philosophy, and then now recently in the past 70 years that philosophy has been completely repudiated, rejected. And it's not just because of what David Ludden mentioned about the capitalist production and how it sucks everybody into its inhumane relationship with nature. Because as Judith Shapiro pointed out, Mao himself was anti-nature. So the question is really much deeper than that, which is that we, all of us, have been complicit in this colonial, imperialist, capitalist project. And what we need to undergo is a decolonization of the mind. And I think what this panel has demonstrated is the pragmatics of the decolonization of the mind, where, for example, when Professor Dong talks about the resilience of the economy, he's really talking about the local responses to dealing with external intervention. And what Sanjay Chakravarty said about the oceanic circle is a concept drawn from a pre-colonial philosophy, non-Western pre-colonial philosophy. And what Nidhi was getting close to was having an alternative approach to understanding these local movements and how they deal with one another, how they negotiate. Negotiation is very much a part of a pre-colonial understanding of dealing with one another. And what Victoria gave us really was an alternative angle into democratic politics through design, where you have no prohibition about the local inputs, and you are actually getting out of all of the social noise that gets in the way by looking purely at design and images. I have to say, I didn't quite understand what you were getting at until the very end. So I thought that this whole panel was the yang to the yin of the first panel, because the first panel presented, created, exposed the elephant in the room, which was colonialism and imperialism. How do we get out of it? And then this panel gave us insight into how to do it and gave me hope, and I hope it gives everybody else here hope as well, to that, yes, there are severe problems, but here are very pragmatic, deep-rooted ways of dealing with those problems, which ultimately leads me to what Brian said about the new school. This is what the new school is all about. So I thank the panels, the panelists, and the organizers of the conference for giving us the kind of inspiration that the new school is all about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lily. That's a very tough comment to follow if the other two still want to, but I will add that the U.S. is a colonized state as well.
Well said.
Yes, right here. Yes.
Thank you all. I want to try to express my thanks to all of you, but I want to keep my question brief. So I want to know that in order to, because I found that we perceive the local knowledge as a tool but I'm just wondering the tool to help whom, and so what's the innovation for? Who is the real kind of group of people that's innovation for? Is that for the local community or for the scientists, or for the outsider, for the NGOs? So I mean, for the local people that the scientists as outsider, as all the scholars, we found that they have this local wisdom that can help to achieve our goal, maybe to protect one kind of animal or protect the environment. But is that their real demands for themselves? So the real empowerment is to let them know clearly what do they really need, but not to just help the scientists to achieve their goal. So in order to answer the question, what's the role of the local community? I think maybe sometimes we can think about what's the role of the scientist as an outsider for the local community. What do they really need? Thank you.
Thank you. Yep. And I think we have one more.
I have a quick question and a comment to you, Sanjay. You know, when you look at a whole range of urban environmental challenges and crises facing the Garhwal Himalayas today, what has been Chipko's urban legacy to such struggles? And has there been an urban Chipko or urban Chipkos? That's my question. And the second is a quick comment on your point about how the movement is essentially framed or imagined. Chipko, for instance, I think it might be useful, and I go along with Nidhi when we say the need to de-romanticize, really. And in this case, especially the need to de-romanticize the community as an actor and to recognize it as a deeply political actor. And we see this in a remarkable way in the Chipko movement, when the community actually, a socio-ecological movement like Chipko, chooses consciously not to challenge state legitimacy, but it chooses to engage with it in very interesting ways. And when you see leaders like Bahuguna and others use very effectively the language of the state, to borrow Perry's phrase. And so you have this entire discourse on forests being critical to national security, being critical to border defense, and so all this is happening in the very straitened discourse, very fragile environment after the '62 crisis. So you have a polarized discourse and a speaking to the status discourse. So some of that also has been very effectively used by leaders like Bahuguna. I think we need to also peel some of that rhetoric. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I would like to close not only this panel, but the session. I think Nidhi and Victoria will join me in thanking Jayanta, Sanjay, and Chipko for incredible contribution. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. And of course, I never get the last word.
I'm just adding to your last word.
Can I tell you, Ashok, we're running over time, so.
I'll be very brief. I think really yin and yang, right? And I think that's a great image to go, and leave this conference with. And I think in some ways, if we can, convene and look back at conversations, many conversations in that way, then I would say that New School, as a place that prides itself for being critical, I think we feel ICI has done a small job in moving that agenda forward. So thank you, Lily, for telling us about that. But I think what I really want to do is in my closing remarks, first thing I want to do is thank ICI fellows, Jayanto, Nidhi, Victoria, Sanjay, Dawn, and Shiping, who's not here, for really, you just are a terrific group of friends, colleagues, for conceptualizing this conference, for really working with my team in putting it together. So I think I can say, for both myself and for everyone here, that we learned a great deal. It was really, really very rich, discussion, and there's much to really think about as we, go on to do, things that we love to do. So thank you all. And also thanks to all the presenters, all the chairs, all the discussants for your, wonderful, very thoughtful, very rich, contributions. So I really want to thank all of you for being part of this conversation. But most importantly, I also want to really thank all the people in the room. I think I was happy to see many students. I was happy to see many old friends, many new friends. And I think unlike many similar type of discussions, I felt that the participants were truly engaged with the deliberations. And your questions, your comments were, in some ways, what made this, conference much more, engaging, much more, fruitful for all of us. So I just want to thank all of you for taking the time and being with us. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see each other again.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashok.